Thanks a lot. I have to say, I planned this presentation for 15 minutes, so I'm not sure. I'm going to try my best. So let's basically run through the first one. I'm going to talk to you about the current transition in international order, this very fancy word that also has a very deep meaning. And I argue for that we're coming to a multipolarized order that has a very much a reduced role for the West as in understood by the United States and European Union. And then I test this with two different theories for the two different meanings of this multipolarized that I introduce. For the Latin America case, as with my previous colleague, my article is nearly done, but not yet, so any comments are very much welcome. So the first part, we're going to talk about literature and international order, and I'm basically going to run through this because it's mostly literature review and we don't have a lot of time. All right. The international order is the set of institutions, norms, rules that govern or define the way states interact. They are about power, they are about ideology, they are about institutions, and they are not necessarily global in nature. There can be several orders. I mean, the classic example is in the Cold War, where you had at least two, maybe more international orders. And the dominant order after the Cold War was definitely the liberal international order, with a big role for the United States. I think most people are aware of what I'm talking about. Where the United States would provide public goods, and the international organizations that came from after 1945 and the Bretton Woods Agreement were broadly respected and seen as players with power in defining these relations between states. I did not talk about several authors, but let's move on. When we talk about order, we talk about several things. We talk about the balance. So how many powers we have? We can have a multipolar order, unipolar order. We can also talk about how the public goods are provided in the system or not, and who provides them, and in what way does the order allow for dominant states, global powers, regional powers to project this power, and in what way? So when we talk about international order, this is what we're talking about. I go into in-depth in the article, but let's move on. And this is not a new argument. Clearly, this international order, however we define it, dominant after 1990, the end of the Cold War, has been disintegrated. I provide three main points in the article, but we could provide more. The iteration of China in the liberal international order, namely when they joined the World Trade Organization, was meant to liberalize China, but instead it provided a rivalry with increasing structural power, a concept I will introduce further later. The hyperglobalization reached the elite and produced economic inequality and social discontent, prompting political backlash in the countries that mostly sustain this order, the Western democracies. I mean, President Trump is the main example, but there's many more, be it in Italy, be it Brexit in UK, you all know about this. And I think this is a factor that's probably created the international order since the beginning, the idea that values should be exported through military intervention. And now we see this in a very negative way. But I remember when I was a kid in the 90s, the idea of liberal international, that we would bring democracy to other countries. This was a great thing that we were doing. This has completely lost its credibility because of the dual standards that the United States, but only the West in general, uses. And also the very, very diverging misuse of the United Nations institutions when it comes to this idea of exporting democracy. Because we all know that international law defends human rights, but it also defends sovereignty. And where the line is traced between the two, this is a conflict that we've never really fully resolved. All right. So what I'm actually doing in this article, I'm providing where I see the international order moving now, introducing a concept called multipolarization, which you might have seen in a slightly different way in the Munich Security Conference. It was a topic this year. And so what is a multipolarized order? It should be seen as two different meanings. First, that there is a polarization within the democracies that sustain the liberal international order, and this polarization, be it in the United States, in the European Union, and even in Latin America, as I will demonstrate, weakens the main supporters of the liberal international order, so the order was already decaying, and now it's dead because even within the democracies that support it, the polarization means that it's no longer, and again, the United States is a clear example, not the only one, but it's also multipolarized because you have different poles of power, namely non-Western, that feed upon the first polarization, and now we have not only a multipolar world, but we have a multipolarized world because we have polarization that is both domestic and international. I could go more in depth, but I don't think I have more time, so let's move on. And so trying to see the evolution, so we had the Cold War with the two main orders, capitalist and socialist orders from 1945 to 1990. This was a bipolar order where the role of international institutions was thin, at least international institutions applied globally. Then we had a liberal international order starting in 1990, which I end in 2008 because of the global financial crisis. I think that's a fairly acceptable endpoint. It was a unipolar order. It was ideological driven, end of history, Fukuyama, democracy as one, free trade, the rest. All of these international institutions, especially IMF, World Bank, they really reached the peak of their influence here. And then after 2008, and this is where we can have, of course, an interesting discussion, I argue that there was not necessarily already a multipolar order, there was just a disintegration of what existed. And we had what I would call transactional regionalism. This is adapted from some authors. I mentioned this in the author, and I'm willing to discuss. So the role of institutions was still reduced, but was present because regions were fracturing. And now we have a multipolarized world order, which I start obviously in 2022 because this is a direct challenge posed to the liberal international order in Europe, where we go back to the same order as we had in the Cold War, this balance of power and ideological competition and very small role of international institutions. So this is what I propose. There's a lot of stuff here. Let's just move on. I already explained this 2 minutes. I thought about 15 minutes. All right, I think we can just move on from this. All right, so can I show that the West as an entity is not only polarized but weaker in the world? I mean, definitely inside the EU, and this was the topic of my PhD in King's College London. I talked about the process of European disintegration connected to the poly crisis, namely the Euro crisis and migration crisis that have, in short, reduced the credibility of the EU supranational institutions. They have pushed the interests of stronger countries versus weaker countries, North versus South, West versus East. It also meant, and I think this was very well reflected in the previous presentation, that there is now a very established conflict between the EU as a normative actor and a geopolitical actor. Can it be both? Is it both? Nobody really knows. In the United States, of course, even before the famous January 2021, I would argue that the role of the United States as this beacon of human rights, which had already been criticized in the 90s, definitely reached this peak in the 2000s. And now we have the America First approach, and I will quote an African politician that I met in a conference now in Germany. He said that for most American politicians, America was always America First, so they just see it as a slogan. But in a way, it's a corollary of this process where the United States now can sustain being the leader or the beacon of disorder. The failure to integrate Russia within Euro-Atlantic structures, I suspect that some people will have an issue with the way I phrase this sentence, but just because Russia as a regime it has an invasion that is undisputable, it does not mean that there was not a failure, because there was, at least rhetorically, an attempt to integrate them into Euro-Atlantic structures, and clearly this did not happen. So that is a failure for me. And an effective defeat. And you talked about EU documents. EU documents in very EU language, they talked about challenges in the so-called arc of visibility. Well, the EU was defeated and the West was defeated in trying to solve these challenges because they didn't mention that this was a priority and they failed. I think this is fair to say. All right. Latin America study case. Latin America is how much time do I have? Nice, please. Almost 5, good. Latin America is an obvious case because, first of all, there are obvious linguistic and cultural attachment to the West, and we are in the Iberian Peninsula, so these ties are even stronger here. There's also actually a very similar historic process with the United States, this beacon of the international order, because you have the revolution against the European colonial powers. You had civil wars that eventually led to a strengthening of democracy. Of course, the parallel is not perfect, but if there is a region where we can test whether the West's reduced role is happening and whether polarization is happening, in fact, it's Latin America. It's also it's still a democratic, like most of the democratic regime, so you can see this polarization in a perfect way. I included this map because, of course, there has been a long attempt, mostly failed to integrate politically the full Latin America. There's a lot of different acronyms. There's Mercosur, and there's Andean Community, and there's now Unisur, which mostly failed. So there will be a lot to delve into. I mentioned this in the article, but let's move on. And of course, there was a project by the United States to have a free trade area that would embark the whole Americas. Since Eisenhower, this failed. So we have a very fragmented picture in Latin America and Caribbean, which mirrors the fragmentation that we see globally. This is a map from the trade areas in the world. All right, so how am I going to measure this reduced role for the West? I chose one of my favorite authors, which I also use in my PhD and adapted it to a broader framework, which is Susan Strange. Some people might be familiar. I would argue that she is one of the most underappreciated IR theorists of the 20th century, and she uses something called structural power. I extensively explain what this is. It will be a lot of time. So she defines that we can see structural power in four main structures: production, financial, security, and the control of knowledge or ideology. And here the control of knowledge could be not just understood as controlling the message, but also controlling the means of diffusion. So you're talking about AI. When you control AI or you control the database, you also control the information. So it does this dual meaning. And then she also mentioned four secondary structures: transport, trade, energy, and welfare. So this is what I'm going to use, and I'm going to apply this to Latin America. So this is in her book, State and Markets. That's where she fully develops the model. All right, so in the security structure, its states, military aids still exists, and this is probably the main structure where the West is still dominant in Latin America. The West, the NATO does not extend to the Atlantic South, as it was mentioned in the first presentation, more to Africa, but also could be said about Latin America. And China and the BRICS bloc, which are compared with the West, they have been actually increasing a lot of arms sales cooperation, namely with Brazil, but not only. So this is the most dominant of the West, but even there, they are losing their dominance. In production, the West has already lost the war in Latin America. This is what happens. China is the main trading power for most of Latin American countries, including the most important ones. So this is already been lost. In the financial structure, the Latin America countries less and less are reluctant to engage with the IMF and World Bank on their rules and their conditionality. And there's a long, difficult story, for instance, in countries as Argentina dealing with the IMF. China at the same time with the Asian Infrastructure Bank, the China Development Bank. There's even plans to have a currency in BRICS. I'm not sure if this will happen, but clearly they are moving very fast in this structure as well. And in terms of knowledge ideational structure, anyone that talks with Latin America elites can understand that they're not just on the left, but their discontentment with the narrative of this world international order is widespread. And China, they are not necessarily an attractive model, but they do control more and more the sources of information. So even on the technological side, I need to speed up, right? All right, I'm gonna try. Right, there's also secondary structures. I'm not going to talk about them all. Let's just talk about the two most obvious ones: the trade structure. China and the BRICS Forum, not just China, have really deepened their cooperation with the Latin America, while the EU has struggled for 25 years to sign a trade deal. We'll go back to that. And on the energy structure, the BRICS countries are now major investors in several energy projects in the EU. There has been some effort by the European Investment Bank, but clearly not enough. I could talk more. Let's move on. So what are the trends? The BRICS and China now project structural power across all dimensions. The Belt and Road Initiative is much larger than the Global Gateway. The United States does not have any rival infrastructure, and the foreign investment from the United States is very much dependent on trends. The last normative appeal on conditional aid model is increasingly outcompeted by China's no strings attached order. This also happens in Africa, but certainly happens in Latin America, because also they don't buy the narrative, so this is all connected. This reflects multipolarization in practice, so China's structural presence that is enabled by the polarization, the lack of structural approach by the EU, the US and the EU. Okay, I have to move on. Yes, so not only decline of international fragmentation, but the consequence of China's and the BRICS increasing ability to shape. All right. Very quickly, the second empirical test is connected with polarization. Polarization is a big problem in democracies in Latin America, big dissatisfaction. I actually used several surveys that were conducted in Latin America. I have to go through them quickly. There's also a lot of story of difficult transitions to democracies in these countries, so conditions that already exist in Latin America. It's not something relatively new. There's a rise of populism in several countries, both on the right and on the left, and actually Latin America has always been shifting towards left and right, and this also undermines the Europe and US approach, because they also have their own polarization going, and I think I need to move on. All right, last but not least, now 1 minute. Possible routes for the West. It seems like the United States, when it comes to Latin America, balances between trying to be a sort of Russian-led hegemon and disinterest, and the EU does not yet have a structured approach to Latin America, even though they have all the possible advantages, culturally speaking, historical. I would argue that, and I made this clear in my article and some numbers here, this is the Mercosur deal is the most obvious win-win for the European Union right now. And even on the environmental risk that I mentioned here, and I will stop with this, it seems like we're doing something right in the European Union, but actually what is happening is that if we don't sign this deal, and this has already been happening, China will make products and BRICS will make products that don't have any sort of environmental standards. So actually we are not only hurting our economy, but we are also hurting the environment. And yes, there's a lot of critical minerals in Latin America, exactly those that the EU needs for its transformation and security capabilities. And I am on this. Thank you.